The lecture hall buzzed with excitement as Professor Zalthara adjusted the holographic display. The massive screen showed the orbital defense grid around Kepler 442b, its energy shields shimmering like soap bubbles in the star's light. Students from 12 different species filled the tiered seats, their various appendages taking notes on quantum tablets and neural interfaces. The siege of Kepler Station represents the greatest military disaster in coalition history. Professor Zalthara began, her crystalline voice carrying easily through the amphitheater. For 3 years, the hegemony forces maintained a perfect blockade. No supplies, no reinforcements, no communication with the outside galaxy. By all military doctrine, the station should have fallen within 6 months. A young Vorthan student raised his secondary arm. Professor, how did 8,000 defenders hold against 2 million attackers for so long? That's precisely what we're here to study, Zalthara replied, manipulating the hologram to show the massive hegemony fleet surrounding the station. The tactical analysis has puzzled military historians for decades. Every simulation we run shows complete defeat for the defenders within standard parameters. In the back corner of the lecture hall, an elderly human pushed a cleaning cart along the wall. His gray hair was thinning, his maintenance uniform faded from years of washing. The students barely noticed him as he emptied waste receptacles and wiped down surfaces. To them, he was just another piece of the university's background machinery. Thomas Chin had been working maintenance at the Galactic Military Academy for 15 years. He preferred the night shifts when the corridors were empty, but sometimes he had to clean during active hours. The pay was decent, and nobody bothered an old janitor who kept to himself. The defenders employed unprecedented resource management, Professor Zalthara continued. They recycled atmospheric gases with 98% efficiency. They grew food in spaces never designed for agriculture. They manufactured ammunition from mining equipment and civilian electronics. A Nexary student, her tentacles writhing with curiosity, asked, "But, Professor, how did they maintain morale?" The psychological pressure must have been overwhelming. Thomas paused in his cleaning, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. These young cadets had no idea what they were discussing. To them, it was ancient history, a puzzle to solve in their strategic studies courses. They analyzed troop movements and supply chains like pieces on a game board. The morale question is particularly fascinating, Zalthara agreed. Historical records show the defenders maintained operational effectiveness even when reduced to quarter rations. They continued launching counterattacks until the final day of the siege. Maybe they knew something we don't, suggested a Krillian student, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. Some secret weapon or hidden advantage. All evidence suggests they were completely cut off, the professor replied. No secret weapons, no hidden advantages. Just 8,000 beings trapped on a space station, facing impossible odds. Thomas finished emptying a waste bin and moved to the next section. These students were brilliant, he had to admit. The best military minds in the galaxy came to study here. But they were studying the siege like archaeologists examining ancient ruins, trying to understand a civilization they'd never experienced. The holographic display shifted to show internal station layouts. Residential sectors, industrial zones, command centers, and maintenance tunnels created a complex three-dimensional maze. Zalthara highlighted different areas as she spoke. The defenders divided into specialized units, she explained. Military personnel maintained the defense grid. Civilians operated essential services. Engineers kept life support functioning under extreme conditions. A human student near the front raised her hand. "Professor, were there any first-hand accounts from survivors?" "Very few," Zalthara replied sadly. "Only 312 beings survived the siege's end. Most were severely traumatized and provided limited testimony. The official records are incomplete." Thomas knew exactly why the records were incomplete. The survivors had been through hell. Most couldn't bear to talk about those 3 years. Those who did speak often left out the worst details, the moments that revealed how close they'd come to complete collapse. "Let's examine the final assault," Professor Zalthara said, bringing up tactical displays. The hegemony launched 17 simultaneous attacks on key positions. By this point, the defenders had lost 60% of their original numbers. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Their food supplies would last perhaps 2 more weeks. The students leaned forward, absorbed in the strategic puzzle. How had such a desperate situation been resolved? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The professor continued. Maintenance workers had been modifying the station's internal systems throughout the siege. They created hidden passages, rerouted power systems, and established secret communication networks. Thomas stopped pushing his cart entirely now. The professor was getting to the interesting part, though she didn't know the half of it. The maintenance workers had been much more than technicians. They'd been the siege's unsung heroes. These modifications allowed the defenders to coordinate what historians call the miracle counterattack, Zalthara said. In a single coordinated strike, they disabled the hegemony's command ship, destroyed 3 heavy cruisers, and opened a corridor for coalition reinforcements to arrive. A Zeldin student, her scales shifting colors with excitement, asked, how did they coordinate such a complex operation with their communications supposedly destroyed? That's one of the siege's greatest mysteries, the professor admitted. The official records mention improvised communication systems, but the technical details were classified and later lost. Thomas almost laughed out loud. Lost. More like deliberately buried. The coalition brass hadn't wanted certain details becoming public knowledge. Some innovations were too dangerous to document. Perhaps we should focus on the human element, suggested the same student who'd asked about first-hand accounts. Humans made up 40% of the defenders. Did their particular psychology contribute to the successful defense? Professor Zalthara's expression grew thoughtful. An interesting question. Human military doctrine emphasizes adaptability and improvisation. They have an unusual tendency to continue fighting even when victory appears mathematically impossible. Is that significant? Asked the Vorthan student. Consider this. Every other species in the coalition would have surrendered or negotiated terms within the first year. The mathematical probability of survival was essentially 0. Yet humans seemed incapable of accepting defeat. Thomas nodded unconsciously. That was exactly right, though the professor was only scratching the surface. Humans had a particular talent for refusing to acknowledge impossible situations. The siege's conclusion remains controversial, Zalthara continued. Some historians argue the counterattack succeeded through luck and desperation. Others believe the defenders had access to classified technology or intelligence. She paused the holographic display and turned to face her students directly. What do you think? Could 8,000 defenders, cut off from all support, really devise a strategy that defeated 2 million attackers through conventional means? The students erupted in discussion. Nexary tentacles waved as they debated probability matrices. Krillian mandibles clicked in rapid exchanges about resource allocation. Zeldin scales shifted through spectrums of color indicating complex emotional states. Thomas listened to their theories with growing amusement. They were all brilliant, all wrong, and all missing the most important factor entirely. A senior cadet, a tall Altarian with ceremonial scars marking her rank, stood to address the class. Professor, I believe we're overcomplicating the analysis. The siege succeeded because the defenders had superior leadership and maintained unit cohesion under extreme pressure. An excellent point, Zalthara agreed. Leadership certainly played a crucial role. Commander Sarachen's tactical decisions were consistently sound throughout the siege. Thomas nearly dropped his cleaning supplies. He hadn't expected to hear his daughter's name spoken so casually. The students were discussing Sarah like a historical figure, analyzing her decisions as abstract military theory. Commander Chin's final gambit was particularly brilliant, a Torvin student added, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence. She concentrated 90% of remaining forces for the counterattack, leaving critical positions virtually undefended. That decision violated every principle of defensive strategy, another student countered. It should have resulted in complete defeat. And, yet it worked, Professor Zalthara noted. Which brings us back to our central question. How do we explain the impossible? Thomas had finished his assigned cleaning tasks, but he found himself reluctant to leave the lecture hall. These young beings were so earnest in their attempts to understand. They analyzed data streams and tactical reports, trying to solve a puzzle through pure intellect. Perhaps, suggested a quiet Auroran student, We should consider that the historical records are incomplete not because information was lost, but because it was deliberately omitted. The class fell silent. Professor Zalthara raised an eyebrow ridge. That's a serious accusation, Cadet THYSS. What would motivate such omissions? Military advantages that remain classified? Technologies still in development? Strategies too sensitive for academic study? Thomas found himself nodding again. The Auroran was closer to the truth than she realized, though still missing the biggest secret of all. An intriguing theory, the professor acknowledged. However, the siege ended 47 years ago. Most military classifications expire after 30 years. Unless they involve ongoing security interests, Cadet THYSS persisted. True. But that raises another question. What could 8,000 desperate defenders have discovered that would remain classified for decades? Thomas knew the answer to that question intimately. The defenders hadn't discovered anything. They'd invented something. Multiple somethings, actually. Technologies and tactics that had been quietly integrated into coalition doctrine without public acknowledgement. I think we're overthinking this, declared a boisterous Corvin student. Maybe humans are just better at fighting impossible battles. Some species excel at mathematics, others at engineering. Humans specialize in stubborn refusal to accept defeat. This comment drew laughter from several species and indignant protests from the human students. That's a gross oversimplification, protested the human cadet who'd asked about first-hand accounts. Military success requires strategy, logistics, and coordination. Individual psychology isn't sufficient to explain the siege's outcome. But it might be necessary, Professor Zalthara observed. Consider the mathematical reality these defenders faced. Every rational analysis indicated certain death. Most species would have sought negotiated surrender to preserve some lives. And humans don't, asked the Nexary student. Historically? Not often. Humans have an unusual relationship with hopeless situations. They tend to interpret impossible as difficult and proceed accordingly. Thomas appreciated the professor's insight, though it only explained part of the story. Yes, humans were stubborn. But stubborn alone wouldn't have saved Kepler Station. The real secret was more complex and far more dangerous to discuss openly. Let's examine specific tactical decisions, Professor Zalthara said, returning to the holographic display. 2 years into the siege, the defenders abandoned the outer defensive ring entirely. This decision allowed hegemony forces to establish forward positions within the station's outer hull. That sounds like desperation, not strategy, observed a Draxian student, her chitinous plates clicking disapprovingly. On the surface, yes. But abandoning the outer ring freed up 800 defenders for other assignments. They were reassigned to what the records vaguely term special projects. The cleaning cart squeaked slightly as Thomas shifted position to hear better. The special projects had been his suggestion, actually. Not that anyone here would believe that. What kind of special projects? Asked the eager Vorthan student. The records are frustratingly vague. Technical modifications to station infrastructure. Improvised equipment development. Alternative resource management systems. Nothing specific enough to understand or replicate. Thomas remembered those projects clearly. They'd been desperate, dangerous, and occasionally brilliant. The kind of innovations that only happened when people had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Professor, called a Theshan student, could we review the siege's timeline? I'm having trouble understanding how the defenders sustained their resistance for 3 full years. Certainly. Year 1 focused on establishing sustainable life support and rationing systems. The defenders reduced the station's active population areas by 60%, concentrating in the most defensible sections. Thomas nodded. They'd essentially abandoned 2/3 of the station, retreating to areas that could be more easily defended and supplied. It had been heartbreaking, leaving spaces where people had lived and worked, but absolutely necessary. Year 2 saw the first serious starvation periods. The professor continued. Food production dropped below minimum requirements. The defenders began experimental nutrition programs and expanded their hydroponic facilities into previously unused areas. The experimental nutrition programs had been awful, Thomas remembered. They'd learned to eat things no civilized being should have to consume. Algae grown in recycled wastewater. protein extracted from filtered atmospheric particles. Emergency rations stretched far beyond their intended duration. By year 3, the situation had become truly desperate, Professor Zalthara explained. Medical supplies were exhausted. Equipment failures cascaded through critical systems. Morale should have collapsed entirely. But it didn't, prompted the Auroran student. According to surviving records, defensive effectiveness actually increased during the final year. The explanation for this apparent paradox remains unclear. Thomas smiled grimly. The explanation was simple enough. They'd stopped fighting by conventional rules. When conventional tactics failed, they'd invented new ones. When standard equipment broke, they'd built replacements from whatever materials they could find. Let's discuss the human factor more specifically, suggested the professor. Humans comprised 40% of the defenders, but took 60% of casualties during the siege's final year. They volunteered for the most dangerous assignments at disproportionate rates. Why? Asked the Corvin student. That's a complex psychological question. Human military culture emphasizes individual sacrifice for group survival. They have an unusual willingness to accept personal risk for abstract principles. Thomas had known many of those volunteers personally. They hadn't been motivated by abstract principles. They'd been fighting for their families, their friends, their home. When someone threatened the people you cared about, humans tended to take it personally. The siege's end came suddenly, Professor Zalthara said, advancing the timeline display. The hegemony forces had begun preparing for a final assault when the defenders launched their counterattack. Within 6 hours, the 3-year siege was over. 6 hours? The Theshan student sounded incredulous. How do you go from desperate defense to total victory in 6 hours? That's precisely what makes this case so remarkable. The transition was so rapid and complete that many historians question whether we have accurate information about the siege's final phase. Thomas knew they had accurate information. They just didn't have complete information. The critical details had been classified so deeply that most of the people who'd lived through them weren't allowed to discuss what had actually happened. Are there any surviving veterans we could interview? Asked the human cadet. Very few agreed to speak with historians, the professor replied. Those who did provide testimony were often contradictory or incomplete in their accounts. Or deliberately misleading, Thomas thought. The survivors had been instructed to keep certain secrets. Some had taken those instructions seriously. Professor, called a student from the back of the hall. What about civilian accounts? Maintenance workers, medical personnel, non-military survivors. Thomas froze. Professor Zalthara's expression grew troubled. An excellent question. Civilian accounts are particularly scarce. Most civilian survivors were transferred to other assignments immediately after the siege. Official policy was to minimize their exposure to continued military analysis. Meaning they were told not to talk about it, the persistent student asked. Meaning they were reassigned to positions where they wouldn't be regularly asked about their experiences, the professor clarified diplomatically. Thomas appreciated the careful phrasing. The truth was less diplomatic. Civilian survivors had been scattered across the galaxy, given new jobs in places where their wartime experiences wouldn't come up in casual conversation. But surely some civilian accounts exist, pressed the Auroran cadet. Very few formal accounts. The siege left most civilians severely traumatized. Many were unwilling or unable to provide detailed testimony about their experiences. The class fell into thoughtful silence. Thomas used the opportunity to resume his cleaning duties, though he continued listening carefully. Let's approach this from another angle, Professor Zalthara suggested. What lessons can modern military planners learn from the Kepler Station siege? Adaptive resource management, suggested the Nexary student. Unconventional tactical thinking, added the Vorthan. The importance of civilian cooperation in extended defensive operations, offered the Draxian. Thomas nodded at each suggestion. They were all valid lessons, though they barely scratched the surface of what the siege had actually taught. All excellent observations, the professor agreed. However, I would argue that the siege's most important lesson is about the unpredictability of desperate situations. When conventional options are exhausted, intelligent beings can become remarkably creative. The elderly janitor in the back of the room smiled to himself. That was exactly right. Desperation had made them all more creative than they'd ever imagined possible. For next week, Professor Zalthara announced, I want you to prepare detailed analyses of 3 specific tactical decisions made during the siege. Choose decisions that seem counterintuitive or strategically questionable. Try to understand the reasoning behind choices that appear to violate conventional military doctrine. Students began gathering their materials as the class period ended. Thomas resumed pushing his cleaning cart toward the exit, but he found himself moving slowly, reluctant to leave the discussion behind. Oh, and one more thing. The professor called out as students filed toward the doors. If anyone knows of surviving veterans or civilians willing to share their experiences, please let me know. First-hand accounts would be invaluable for our research. Thomas paused at the threshold. For just a moment, he considered turning around and walking back to the podium. He could identify himself, offer to share what he remembered, provide the first-hand account these eager students were seeking. But then, he thought about the classification agreements he'd signed, the promises he'd made to keep certain secrets, the reasons those secrets had been deemed necessary in the first place. Instead, he pushed his cart through the doorway and continued down the corridor. Behind him, students continued discussing the siege in excited clusters, debating theories and analyzing data points. None of them noticed the maintenance worker disappearing around the corner. None of them realized they'd just missed their chance to hear the truth about humanity's greatest military victory from someone who'd helped make it possible. Thomas Chun, former technical specialist first class, former inventor of 17 different siege-breaking technologies, former recipient of medals he'd never been allowed to claim publicly, returned to his quiet life as an invisible janitor. But he couldn't stop listening to their questions. And he couldn't stop thinking about the young minds trying so hard to understand a puzzle they'd never be able to solve without the missing pieces. Perhaps it was time to reconsider those classification agreements. Perhaps 47 years was long enough to keep certain secrets. Perhaps the truth about Kepler Station deserved to be told. Thomas Chin stood outside Professor Zalthara's office for nearly 10 minutes before finally knocking. Through the translucent door, he could see her working late into the evening, reviewing holographic displays of the Kepler Station siege. The same tactical analyses, the same incomplete records, the same frustrating gaps in understanding. "Come in," the professor called without looking up from her work. Thomas entered quietly, still wearing his maintenance uniform. Professor Zalthara glanced up briefly, then returned to her displays. "I'm sorry, but I'm not finished in here yet. Could you return in an hour?" "Actually, Professor, I'm not here to clean your office." This time she looked up fully, her crystalline features reflecting confusion. "I'm sorry, my name is Thomas Chun. I was in your lecture yesterday, listening to your discussion about the Kepler Station siege." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I wanted to speak with you about your research." Professor Zalthara's expression shifted from confusion to polite professional interest. "Oh, you're a student? I didn't recognize you from yesterday's class." "No, ma'am. I'm maintenance staff here at the academy." Thomas straightened slightly. "But I have information that might be relevant to your studies." "Information about the siege?" Her tone was skeptical but curious. "What sort of information?" Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew a small data pad. With practiced movements, he called up his service record and placed the device on her desk. "I was there, Professor. I was a technical specialist first class assigned to Infrastructure Maintenance Division during the entire 3-year siege." Professor Zalthara stared at the data pad for several long seconds before picking it up. Her crystalline fingers traced over the text as she read. Thomas watched her expression change from skepticism to surprise to amazement. "This service record, these commendations, you really were there?" "Yes, ma'am. For all 3 years." She studied his face with new intensity, as if seeing him for the first time. "Why are you telling me this now, after all these years?" Thomas settled into the chair across from her desk. "Because yesterday I listened to your students try to understand something that doesn't make sense without the missing pieces. You're teaching them that the siege was some kind of miracle, an impossible victory achieved through luck and stubbornness. Wasn't it?" "No, Professor. It was engineering. It was innovation. It was 8,000 people who refused to die quietly, so they figured out how to live loudly instead." Professor Zalthara leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "The official records mention technical modifications and improvised equipment, but they provide no details. Because the details were classified. Some probably still are. Thomas gestured toward her holographic displays. Your students are trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. And you have the missing pieces? I helped create some of them. The professor was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas with obvious fascination. What you're suggesting, it would revolutionize our understanding of the siege. Why haven't you spoken to historians before? Classification agreements, non-disclosure contracts, official requests to maintain operational security. Thomas shrugged. I've been keeping my mouth shut for 47 years. What changed? Thomas thought about the eager students, their genuine curiosity, their frustration with incomplete information. Maybe I'm just tired of watching young minds struggle with questions they can't answer because the grown-ups decided some secrets were more important than education. Professor Zalthara stood and began pacing behind her desk. If what you're saying is true, if there really are technical innovations that could explain the siege's outcome, this could be the most significant historical discovery in decades. It's true. Question is whether anyone wants to hear it. She stopped pacing and looked directly at him. I want to hear it. My students want to hear it. The entire academic community wants to hear it. Thomas considered this carefully. Professor, some of what we did during the siege, it wasn't just innovative. It was dangerous. Technologies that could be misused in the wrong hands. Strategies that could be turned against civilian populations. Is that why the records were classified? Part of it. The other part was that some of our innovations made certain coalition military advantages, let's say less unique, than the brass preferred. Professor Zalthara returned to her seat. Mr. Chun, would you be willing to participate in a formal interview? For academic purposes? Depends on what you want to know. Everything. How did you survive? What innovations made the difference? How did 8,000 beings hold against 2 million for 3 years? Thomas smiled grimly. That's a long story, Professor. I have time. Thomas looked at the holographic displays showing the station's layout. The first thing you have to understand is that we weren't trying to win. Not at first. We were just trying not to die today. Explain that. When the siege began, everyone knew we were doomed. The mathematics were clear. 2 million hegemony troops, unlimited supplies, complete orbital control, versus 8,000 defenders, finite resources, no possibility of reinforcement. Thomas gestured at the tactical display. Any reasonable analysis said we'd last maybe 6 months. But you lasted 3 years. Because after the first month, we stopped thinking like reasonable people. We started thinking like desperate people. And desperate people do things that reasonable people consider impossible. Professor Zalthara activated her recording equipment. Give me an example. Food production. Your records probably show that we expanded hydroponic facilities, right? Yes. The historical accounts mention converting and used spaces into agricultural areas. What they don't mention is how we expanded those facilities. We didn't just plant vegetables in empty rooms. We redesigned the station's entire atmospheric system to support agriculture. Thomas stood and walked to the holographic display, pointing at various sections. We rerouted air circulation patterns to optimize plant growth. We modified waste processing systems to create fertilizer. We altered artificial gravity generators to create more efficient growing conditions. That's not possible. Those systems are fundamental to station operation. That's what everyone said, right up until we did it. Thomas smiled. Desperation is a wonderful motivator for innovation. Professor Zalthara was taking rapid notes. How did you coordinate such complex modifications without proper engineering staff? Who says we didn't have proper engineering staff? Every maintenance worker on that station had to become an engineer. Every civilian became a researcher. Every child old enough to hold tools became a technician. Children, Professor, when you're fighting for survival, you use every resource available. We had kids as young as 12 working in spaces too small for adults to access. They crawled through ventilation systems, making modifications that kept us alive. The professor's expression showed concern. That seems ethically questionable. Maybe. But the alternative was watching those children starve to death or die in hegemony prison camps. Thomas returned to his chair. Ethics become more flexible when extinction is the alternative. Tell me about the technical modifications. What specific innovations made the difference? Thomas considered how much to reveal. We developed closed-loop life support systems that operated at 98% efficiency. Most stations consider 80% excellent. How? Biological filtration. We used modified plant species to process atmospheric contaminants. We created bacterial cultures that could break down waste products into usable materials. We essentially turned the entire station into a living organism. Professor Zalthara's eyes widened. That's biotechnology decades ahead of anything in current use. It was biotechnology born of desperation. When your air recyclers break and replacement parts are impossible to obtain, you learn to use whatever's available. What else? Thomas leaned forward. We developed electromagnetic pulse weapons from industrial equipment. We created communication systems that couldn't be detected or jammed. We built manufacturing facilities that could produce ammunition from scrap metal. How did you manufacture ammunition without proper facilities? Ever heard of microfabrication? We took apart every non-essential device on the station. Electronics, appliances, decorative items, personal possessions. Everything became raw materials for something more useful. Professor Zalthara was writing furiously. The records mention hidden communication networks. How did you establish those? We used the station's existing infrastructure in ways it wasn't designed for. Power conduits became data transmission lines. Water pipes carried encoded signals. Waste disposal systems became information networks. That's brilliant. That's survival. Brilliant was when we figured out how to use those same networks to control station systems remotely. The professor looked up from her notes. Remote control of what systems? Thomas hesitated. This was approaching classified territory. Life support, environmental controls, emergency systems. For coordination purposes? Among other things. Professor Zalthara studied his expression carefully. Mr. Chun, what aren't you telling me? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Professor, some of our innovations were defensive in nature, designed to prevent the station from falling into enemy hands. You mean self-destruct systems? I mean fail-safe systems. If the siege had ended differently, if the hegemony had taken the station, he didn't finish the sentence. Understanding dawned in the professor's crystalline features. You could have destroyed the entire station. We could have destroyed the entire system. Station, orbital defenses, anything within a significant radius. The weight of this revelation settled over them both. Professor Zalthara set down her stylus. That's why the records were classified. Part of it. Coalition Command didn't want potential enemies knowing that desperate defenders could turn any installation into a weapon of mass destruction. How many people knew about these fail-safe systems? Maybe 50. Most of the defenders didn't know how close they came to taking the whole system with them. Professor Zalthara was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the implications. Mr. Chun, what you're describing, it's not just military innovation. It's a fundamental transformation of how we think about defensive strategy. It's what happens when people refuse to accept defeat. Humans have a particular talent for that. Is that why humans took such heavy casualties during the final year? Thomas's expression darkened. Humans volunteered for the most dangerous assignments because we understood something the other species didn't. What? That sometimes survival requires someone to do things that can't be undone. Someone has to carry the weight of necessary choices. Professor Zalthara leaned forward. What kind of choices? The kind that save lives, but cost souls. The kind that preserve a future by sacrificing a past. Thomas met her gaze directly. The kind that young military students shouldn't have to make. But you made them. We made them because the alternative was extinction. Not just for us, but for everyone we were protecting. The professor was quiet again, considering the implications. Mr. Chun, would you be willing to share this information with my students? They could learn more from one conversation with you than from months of studying incomplete records. Thomas thought about the eager young faces in her lecture hall. What would you tell them? The truth, that the siege wasn't won by luck or stubbornness. It was won by intelligence, innovation, and sacrifice. And the classified parts? We'll discuss what can be shared publicly and what should remain restricted. Thomas nodded slowly. I'd be willing to speak with them. But I have conditions. What conditions? First, this isn't a war story. I'm not going to glorify what we did or make it sound heroic. It was necessary, but it wasn't pretty. Understood. Second, I want to emphasize the civilian contributions. Military histories always focus on soldiers, but the siege was won by everyone. Engineers, doctors, teachers, children. Everyone contributed. Of course. Third, I want to discuss the cost. Not just casualties, but the psychological impact. What it does to people when they have to live like that for 3 years. Professor Zalthara nodded seriously. That's important context. Thomas stood to leave, then paused at the door. Professor, there's one more thing your students should understand about the siege. What's that? We weren't special. We weren't superheroes or legendary warriors. We were ordinary people who found themselves in an impossible situation and refused to give up. He looked back at her displays showing the tactical analyses. Anyone could have done what we did if they'd been desperate enough and stubborn enough to keep trying. I think you underestimate yourselves. Thomas smiled sadly. I think you overestimate us. We were just people who ran out of options except survival. After he left, Professor Zalthara sat alone in her office, staring at the holographic displays with new understanding. The siege hadn't been a miracle or an impossible victory. It had been 8,000 ordinary beings who'd transformed themselves into something extraordinary because the alternative was death. She began composing a message to her department head, requesting permission to bring a guest lecturer to her next class. Someone who could provide the first-hand account that would finally solve the puzzle of Kepler Station. For the first time in decades, the legendary siege was about to be explained by someone who'd actually lived through it. Professor Zalthara worked late into the night, preparing questions and reviewing her existing research with new perspective. Tomorrow, her students would learn that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. And sometimes the janitor knows more about history than the historians. The next morning, Professor Zalthara arrived early to prepare her lecture hall. She'd spent hours reviewing Thomas Chen's service record, cross-referencing his assignments with historical events, verifying details wherever possible. Everything checked out. More than that, his account explained dozens of inconsistencies and gaps in the official records. Students began filing into the hall, chattering about their weekend analyses of the siege's tactical decisions. They'd prepared detailed presentations about counterintuitive strategies and questionable command choices. None of them suspected they were about to hear from someone who'd helped make those very decisions. Good morning. Professor Zalthara began as the last students took their seats. Before we review your analytical presentations, I have an announcement. We have a guest lecturer today, someone with unique insight into the Kepler Station siege. A ripple of interest passed through the hall. Guest lecturers were rare, especially for historical subjects. Our guest is Thomas Chen, a technical specialist first class who served during the entire 3-year siege. The hall fell completely silent. Several students looked around as if expecting to see a distinguished military veteran in dress uniform. Thomas entered through the back door, still wearing his maintenance clothes. The same elderly janitor who'd been cleaning their classroom just days before. Students stared in shock as he walked down the center aisle toward the podium. Some of you may have seen Mr. Chen around campus. Professor Zalthara continued smoothly. He's worked maintenance here for 15 years. What you didn't know is that before his career at the academy, he was one of the people who made the impossible victory at Kepler Station possible. Thomas reached the front of the hall and turned to face the students. Their expressions ranged from amazement to skepticism to embarrassment at having ignored him so completely. Good morning, Thomas said simply. Professor Zalthara asked me to share some memories about the siege. I'm not much of a speaker, so please stop me if you have questions. The Auroran cadet, THYSS, raised a tentative hand. Mr. Chen, you were really there? During the entire siege? Yes. I was assigned to Infrastructure Maintenance Division. My job was keeping life support systems operational. But the young Vorthan student who'd asked so many questions looked confused. You're a janitor. Thomas smiled. I'm a maintenance worker. During the siege, that meant I was responsible for keeping 8,000 people alive in a space designed for 3,000, with resources for maybe 500. How is that possible? Asked the Nexary student. Very carefully, and with a lot of improvisation. Professor Zalthara gestured toward the holographic display. Mr. Chen, perhaps you could start by explaining how the defenders modified the station's systems to sustain such a large population. Thomas studied the three-dimensional layout, then pointed to specific sections. We essentially redesigned the station from the inside out. These residential areas? We increased capacity by 400%. How? Asked the eager human cadet. Vertical sleeping arrangements. Shared living spaces. We converted every storage room, every unused office, every maintenance area into living space. He manipulated the hologram to highlight different systems. But the real challenge wasn't space. It was resources. Air, water, food, power. The station's infrastructure couldn't support our population. So what did you do? Asked the Draxian student. We upgraded it. Completely. Every system on the station was modified, enhanced, or replaced with something more efficient. Thomas highlighted the atmospheric processing areas. Air recycling, for example. Standard systems operated at maybe 75% efficiency. We needed better. How much better? Professor Zalthara prompted. 98%. We couldn't afford to waste anything. The Thesian student leaned forward. What modifications made that possible? Biological filtration. We used living plants as atmospheric processors. Created bacterial cultures that could break down contaminants. Essentially turned the air recycling system into a living ecosystem. The Corvin student paused, calculating. That's biotechnology decades ahead of current standards. That's desperation meeting necessity. When you can't breathe, you learn to make air however you can. Thomas continued highlighting different areas. Water recycling operated at similar efficiency levels. We processed everything. Atmospheric humidity, wastewater, even moisture from exhaled breath. Nothing was wasted. What about food production? Asked Cadet THYSS. We converted 40% of the station into agricultural space. Hydroponic facilities, bacterial protein cultivation, even insect farming. Several students looked uncomfortable at this last detail. I know it sounds unpleasant, Thomas acknowledged. But insects are efficient protein sources. When you're starving, you learn to appreciate efficiency over aesthetics. The human cadet raised her hand. Mr. Chun, the records mention hidden communication networks. How did you establish those without proper equipment? Thomas smiled. Who says we didn't have proper equipment? We just used it differently than intended. He gestured toward the power distribution systems shown in the hologram. Electrical conduits carry power. But they can also carry data signals if you know how to encode them properly. You used the power grid as a communication network? Among other things. Water pipes, ventilation systems, waste disposal networks. Any physical infrastructure could be adapted for communication if necessary. Professor Zalthara activated a tactical display. This allowed unprecedented coordination of defensive operations. More than that, Thomas said, it allowed us to monitor and control every system on the station remotely. Life support, environmental controls, manufacturing facilities, defensive systems. The Alterian cadet with ceremonial scars leaned forward. Remote control of defensive systems? That seems like a security risk. Thomas met her gaze directly. It was a security measure. If the station had fallen to hegemony forces, we needed to ensure it couldn't be used against coalition worlds. Understanding dawned in several faces. The Zeldan student's scales shifted to pale colors indicating alarm. You could have destroyed the station. We could have destroyed everything within a significant radius, Thomas confirmed quietly. The hall fell completely silent. These eager young cadets were finally understanding the true stakes of the siege they'd been studying as abstract military theory. Did the other defenders know? Asked the Thesian student quietly. Most didn't need to know. It was a fail-safe system, designed to be used only if all other options were exhausted. How close did you come to using it? The question came from the back of the hall. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Closer than anyone should have to come. Professor Zalthara sensed the mood in the hall shifting toward something too dark for an educational setting. Mr. Chun, perhaps you could tell us about the innovations that led to the successful counterattack. Thomas nodded gratefully. The counterattack was possible because we'd spent 3 years learning to use our infrastructure creatively. We didn't just modify systems for survival. We modified them for warfare. He highlighted the manufacturing areas on the holographic display. These sections produced ammunition, weapons, and equipment from civilian materials. We built electromagnetic pulse weapons from industrial equipment, created shaped charges from mining explosives, manufactured communications gear from entertainment systems. How did you coordinate such complex manufacturing without proper facilities? Asked the Draxian student. Distributed production. Every work area became a manufacturing center. People produced components in their living spaces, assembled devices in communal areas, tested equipment wherever they could find room. That sounds incredibly inefficient, observed the Corvin student. It was incredibly resilient. Hegemony forces could destroy individual production areas without significantly impacting our overall capabilities. Thomas paused, looking out at the young faces listening so intently. But the real secret of the counterattack wasn't technology. It wasn't tactics or strategy or brilliant leadership. What was it? Asked Cadet THYSS. It was 8,000 people who'd spent 3 years learning that impossible things become possible if you refuse to accept failure. The simple statement carried enormous weight in the quiet hall. Mr. Chun, said the human cadet, what would you want modern military planners to learn from the siege? Thomas considered the question carefully. That conventional military thinking has limitations. When conventional options are exhausted, intelligent beings become remarkably creative. Any other lessons? Yes, that survival often depends on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The siege wasn't won by brilliant generals or advanced technology. It was won by maintenance workers and teachers and doctors and children who refused to give up. The hall remained quiet as students absorbed these revelations. Finally, Professor Zalthara spoke. Mr. Chun, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. This has been invaluable for understanding one of the most significant military events in Coalition history. Thomas nodded to the class. Thank you for listening. And remember, the siege was 47 years ago. Most of the technologies we developed have been improved and integrated into standard Coalition doctrine. The lessons we learned are being used to protect people throughout the galaxy. As students began filing out of the hall, many stopped to speak with Thomas directly. They asked detailed questions about specific innovations, requested clarification about technical processes, and expressed amazement at meeting someone who'd actually lived through the events they'd been studying. The elderly janitor answered each question patiently, providing the kind of first-hand insight that no historical record could capture. Professor Zalthara watched the interactions with satisfaction. Her students were finally understanding that history wasn't just data and analysis. It was real events experienced by real people who'd made real choices under impossible circumstances. And sometimes, the most important teachers were the ones you'd never expect. Word of Thomas Chin's revelation spread through the Galactic Military Academy like wildfire. Within days, his guest lecture had become the subject of intense discussion in academic circles throughout the Coalition. Military historians, strategic analysts, and technology researchers all wanted to speak with the maintenance worker who'd helped design humanity's greatest defensive victory. Thomas found himself in an unexpected position. For 47 years, he'd lived quietly, keeping his secrets and maintaining a low profile. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to hear his story. Professor Zalthara's office became an informal meeting ground for researchers from across the galaxy. She'd arranged follow-up interviews with Thomas, each session revealing new details about the siege that had been lost to classification and time. Mr. Chun, said Dr. Korth, a Draxian strategic analyst who'd traveled from the Central War College specifically for these interviews. Your account suggests that the siege defenders essentially created an entirely new category of military technology. Is that accurate? Thomas sat comfortably in the familiar office, surrounded by recording equipment and holographic displays. We created solutions to problems we'd never faced before. Whether that constitutes new technology depends on your definitions. Could you be more specific? Thomas gestured toward a display showing the station's modified life support systems. Take atmospheric processing, for example. We developed biological filtration methods that are only now being implemented in civilian stations. 47 years later, Dr. Korth's mandibles clicked with interest. Why the delay in implementation? Military secrecy, initially. Later, cost and complexity. Our modifications were designed for survival, not efficiency or economics. Professor Zalthara leaned forward. Thomas, yesterday you mentioned that humans took disproportionate casualties during the final year. Could you elaborate on that? Thomas's expression grew somber. Humans volunteered for assignments that other species considered suicidal. Not because we were braver, but because we processed risk differently. How so? Asked Dr. Veltar, a Nexary psychologist who specialized in military stress responses. Most species make decisions based on probability of survival. Humans make decisions based on probability of success. Sometimes those aren't the same thing. Dr. Veltar's tentacles writhed thoughtfully. Can you give an example? Thomas was quiet for a moment, accessing memories he'd tried to forget. During the final assault preparation, we needed to disable hegemony sensor arrays that were monitoring our defensive positions. The arrays were located in sections of the station that had been breached and were exposed to vacuum. Dangerous work, Dr. Korth observed. Lethal work. Environmental suits couldn't be properly maintained after 3 years of siege. Equipment failures were common. Anyone who volunteered for exterior operations had maybe a 60% chance of survival. But the mission was essential. Professor Zalthara prompted. Critical. Without disabling those sensors, our counterattack would have been detected before it began. The entire 3-year defense would have been wasted. Dr. Veltar leaned forward. How did you select personnel for such dangerous assignments? We didn't select anyone. Humans volunteered, faster than we could process the applications. Why? Thomas met the psychologist's gaze directly. Because someone had to do it. And humans have an unusual relationship with necessary impossibilities. The room fell quiet as the researchers absorbed this statement. Thomas, Professor Zalthara said gently, were you one of those volunteers? I coordinated the technical aspects of the sensor disruption operation. My job was to ensure that if someone was going to risk their life, the mission would actually succeed. Did it succeed? The sensors were disabled. The counterattack proceeded as planned. Kepler Station was saved. And the volunteers? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Some came back. The weight of that simple statement settled over everyone in the room. Dr. Korth clicked his mandibles softly. Mr. Chun, in your opinion, what made the difference between success and failure during the siege? Refusal to accept failure. Every time we encountered an impossible problem, we found a way to make it possible. But surely there were limitations. Moments when even human stubbornness couldn't overcome reality. Thomas smiled grimly. Doctor, human stubbornness isn't about overcoming reality. It's about changing reality until it becomes survivable. Professor Zalthara activated a new display showing the siege's timeline. Thomas, could you walk us through the counterattack itself? The historical records are particularly sparse about the final 6 hours. Thomas studied the timeline carefully. The counterattack wasn't a single operation. It was 17 coordinated strikes happening simultaneously across the entire station. How did you coordinate 17 operations with supposedly destroyed communication systems? With the networks we'd built to replace the destroyed systems. Remember, we'd spent 3 years modifying every piece of infrastructure on the station. Dr. Veltar gestured toward her notes. You mentioned using power conduits, water pipes, and ventilation systems for communication. How sophisticated were these improvised networks? Sophisticated enough to coordinate precision strikes on 17 different targets within a 6-hour window. Thomas highlighted different areas on the holographic display. Each strike team had specific objectives. Disable hegemony command centers. Destroy their communication arrays. Target their power generation facilities. Eliminate their defensive positions. That level of coordination typically requires months of planning, Dr. Korth observed. We've been planning for 3 years. Every modification we made to station systems included tactical considerations. By the time we launched the counterattack, we knew every meter of that station better than the people who designed it. Professor Zalthara brought up tactical analyses. The historical records show that the defenders concentrated 90% of their remaining forces for the counterattack. This seems incredibly risky. It was incredibly risky. But it was also the only option that offered any chance of success. Explain that decision-making process. Thomas leaned back in his chair. By the final year, we were down to about 3,000 effective defenders. Our ammunition was nearly exhausted. Our equipment was failing faster than we could repair it. Food supplies would last maybe 2 more weeks. Desperation, Dr. Veltar observed. Clarity. We weren't going to survive a prolonged defense anyway. The counterattack was our only chance to change the strategic situation. But concentrating 90% of your forces meant abandoning critical defensive positions, Dr. Korth pointed out. Critical defensive positions that we couldn't hold anyway. We had 3,000 people trying to defend installations designed for 10,000 defenders. Thomas highlighted the abandoned positions on the display. Instead of spreading our forces thin across positions we couldn't maintain, we concentrated everything on objectives that could actually end the siege. The gamble worked, Professor Zaltharon noted. The gamble was unavoidable. We were going to lose unless we changed the game entirely. Dr. Veltar consulted her notes. Thomas, you mentioned that the counterattack disabled the Hegemony command ship. How did defenders trapped on a space station attack ships in orbit? Thomas smiled slightly. Who said we were trapped on the station? The researchers exchanged glances. Dr. Korth leaned forward. What do you mean? The station's docking bays were damaged early in the siege, but not destroyed. We'd spent 3 years modifying small craft for various purposes. What purposes? Resource recovery, mostly. Salvaging materials from destroyed sections of the station. Retrieving supplies from damaged Hegemony vessels. Professor Zalthara's expression showed amazement. You were conducting offensive operations throughout the siege? Small-scale operations. Nothing that would provoke major retaliation. But we learned a great deal about Hegemony technology and tactics. Did the Hegemony forces know about these operations? They knew they were losing equipment and personnel to what they classified as unexplained incidents. They didn't realize the defenders were actively studying their capabilities. Dr. Korth clicked his mandibles rapidly. You were conducting intelligence-gathering operations while under siege? We were surviving by any means necessary. Intelligence gathering was part of survival. Thomas manipulated the display to show the station's modified docking areas. By the time we launched the counterattack, we had detailed information about Hegemony ship layouts, communication protocols, and security procedures. How did you use this information during the counterattack? Strike teams weren't just attacking the station's Hegemony positions. They were attacking Hegemony vessels directly. The room fell completely silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Mr. Chun, Dr. Veltar said carefully, are you saying that siege defenders launched offensive operations against the Hegemony fleet? I'm saying that by the final assault, the distinction between defense and offense had become meaningless. We were fighting for survival using every available resource. Professor Zalthara was taking rapid notes. This explains how the counterattack succeeded so quickly. You weren't just defending the station. You were attacking the siege force itself. We were ending the siege by eliminating its ability to continue. Dr. Korth gestured toward the tactical displays. The historical records show that 3 Hegemony heavy cruisers were destroyed during the counterattack. How did station defenders destroy capital ships? Thomas hesitated. This was approaching information that might still be classified. Improvised explosive devices, placed in critical locations by personnel who understood the ship's vulnerabilities. Suicide attacks. Volunteer attacks. Some of the volunteers survived. The distinction was important, though the researchers understood that survival hadn't been the primary consideration. Thomas, Professor Zalthara said gently, how many people knew about the full scope of the counterattack plan? Maybe 200. Most defenders knew their specific assignments, but not the overall strategy. For operational security? For psychological reasons. If people had understood how desperate the situation really was, morale might have collapsed entirely. Dr. Veltar studied her notes. You maintain morale by limiting information about the true strategic situation? We maintain morale by focusing on immediate objectives rather than ultimate outcomes. People could handle daily challenges. They couldn't handle the knowledge that every day might be the last. But you handled that knowledge, Dr. Korth observed. Those of us in leadership positions didn't have a choice. Someone had to carry the weight of understanding how close we were to complete failure. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That's why humans took so many casualties during the final year. We weren't just fighting the Hegemony. We were fighting despair. Professor Zalthara leaned forward. How do you fight despair? With purpose. With tasks that matter. With the knowledge that what you're doing serves something larger than yourself. And when purpose isn't enough, Thomas smiled sadly. Then you pretend it is, and you keep working anyway. The researchers spent several more hours discussing technical details, tactical decisions, and strategic considerations. Thomas answered each question with the patient precision of someone who'd lived through events that others could only study. As the interview concluded, Dr. Veltar asked one final question. Thomas, after everything you experienced during the siege, how do you feel about your current position here at the Academy? Thomas considered this carefully. Peaceful. I spent 3 years in a situation where every decision could mean life or death for thousands of people. Now I clean classrooms and maintain equipment. It's a good life. Don't you miss the challenge? The sense of purpose. I found a different purpose. These students will become military officers throughout the coalition. Some will face impossible situations. Maybe something they learn here will help them find solutions when conventional options are exhausted. Professor Zalthara smiled. Teaching without teaching. Serving without commanding. I've had enough of command responsibilities for one lifetime. As the researchers gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Dr. Korth approached Thomas directly. Mr. Chun, would you be willing to participate in additional interviews? The Coalition Strategic Institute would like to conduct a comprehensive analysis of siege innovations and their modern applications. Thomas nodded. As long as we can discuss what should remain classified and what can be shared publicly. Of course, some technologies might be too dangerous for general distribution. Some technologies definitely are too dangerous. But the principles behind them, the approaches to problem solving under extreme pressure, those lessons could save lives. After everyone had left, Thomas and Professor Zalthara sat alone in the quiet office. Thomas, she said, thank you for sharing all of this. My students will never forget what they've learned from you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell the story properly. For 47 years, people have studied the siege as if it were some kind of miracle. Now they can understand it as what it really was, which is 8,000 ordinary people who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and refused to give up. Professor Zalthara was quiet for a moment. Will you continue speaking with researchers and students? As long as it serves a useful purpose. The siege taught us things that could help future defenders facing similar situations. And the classified technologies? Thomas smiled. The classified technologies have already been integrated into coalition defensive systems. What we developed during the siege has been protecting people throughout the galaxy for decades, without public acknowledgement of where those innovations originated. The innovation matters more than the credit. As long as people are safer because of what we learned, the siege served its purpose. Thomas stood to leave, then paused at the door. Professor, there's one more thing your students should understand about the siege. What's that? It ended 47 years ago, but the principles we used are timeless. When conventional options are exhausted, intelligence and determination can create new possibilities. Any situation? Any situation where people refuse to accept defeat. Professor Zalthara watched him walk down the corridor, returning to his quiet life as a maintenance worker. But now she understood that his real job had never been cleaning classrooms. His real job was carrying the memory of humanity's greatest defensive victory and sharing its lessons with the next generation of military leaders. The siege of Kepler Station had ended decades ago, but its most important legacy was walking the halls of the Galactic Military Academy every day, invisible to most, but available to anyone who asked the right questions. In the weeks that followed Thomas's revelations, the Academy's curriculum underwent significant changes. Professor Zalthara developed new courses focusing on innovative problem-solving under extreme pressure. Military engineering programs began studying biological integration with technological systems. Strategic planning courses emphasized the importance of civilian populations in extended defensive operations. Thomas found himself in increasing demand as a guest lecturer, not just at the Academy, but at military institutions throughout the coalition. He traveled to speak with engineering students, strategic planners, and military commanders who wanted to understand how impossible defensive situations could be transformed into successful outcomes. But he always returned to his maintenance duties at the Academy. In the early morning hours, when the corridors were empty and quiet, he could be found ensuring that the next generation of military leaders had clean classrooms and functioning equipment for their studies. Students who passed him in the hallways now recognized the elderly janitor as the man who'd helped save Kepler Station. Some stopped to ask questions about the siege or to discuss their own studies. Thomas answered each question patiently, sharing insights that no textbook could provide. Mr. Chun, a young human cadet, asked one morning as Thomas cleaned her classroom, "Do you think we could do what you did if we faced a similar situation?" Thomas paused in his work and considered the question seriously. "You could do better. You have advantages we didn't have. Better training, better equipment, better understanding of what's possible when people refuse to give up. But do we have the same determination? That depends on what you're fighting for," Thomas replied. "We were fighting for our families, our friends, our home. We were fighting for the right to continue existing. When you're fighting for something that matters more than your own life, determination becomes easier." The cadet nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, sir." Thomas returned to his cleaning. Around him, the Academy continued its mission of training the galaxy's finest military minds. In classrooms throughout the building, students studied tactics and strategy, logistics and leadership, technology and warfare. But in one quiet corner of the institution, an elderly maintenance worker carried the memory of humanity's greatest victory and shared its lessons with anyone wise enough to listen. The siege of Kepler Station had ended 4 decades ago, but its most important lesson continued to be taught every day by a janitor who understood that the greatest victories are won by ordinary people who refuse to accept ordinary limitations. And sometimes, the most valuable education comes from the most unexpected teachers. Thomas Chun had spent 3 years proving that impossible situations become possible when intelligence meets determination. Now he spent his days ensuring that future military leaders understood that lesson, one conversation at a time. The siege was over. The education was eternal.